They called her Eliza, a maid in Judge Harlan's grand house, quiet hands carrying silver trays, quiet eyes hiding a storm. To the world, she was just another servant. To her master, she was property, soon to be handed to his son like a gift. But Eliza was listening, waiting. Each night she crushed herbs in secret, whispering the name of her sister who'd been sold away. And one evening, she slipped poison into the judge's tea. That single cup turned the mansion into chaos, and her flight into the swamps lit the fuse of a legend. Because this isn't only the story of a slave who ran. It's the story of a woman who used fire and poison to turn chains into freedom. And the question is, what price must she pay for daring to be free? Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. The gray light of dawn crept through the cracks of the slave quarters as Eliza stirred from her thin pallet. The rough wooden planks beneath her had left her muscles stiff, but she knew better than to linger. Already she could hear the overseer's heavy boots crunching on the gravel outside. "Get up! Time for work!" Grady's voice boomed through the quarters, followed by the sharp rap of his stick against the door. Eliza smoothed her simple cotton dress and tied her head wrap with practiced movements. Around her, other slaves were rising too, their faces wearing the same mask of quiet resignation. But behind Eliza's calm exterior, bitter thoughts churned like storm clouds. The morning air was thick with humidity as she made her way to the big house. The white-columned mansion loomed against the pink sky, its windows still dark. Eliza's first task was always the same: prepare Judge Harlan's chambers before he woke. She slipped in through the back entrance, careful to keep her footsteps silent on the polished floors. The judge's bedroom smelled of tobacco and expensive cologne. Eliza opened the heavy curtains, watching dust motes dance in the early light. She gathered yesterday's clothes, straightened the writing desk, and emptied the chamber pot with mechanical precision. These rooms held memories that made her hands shake. It was here, just last spring, that she'd last seen her sister Sarah. The judge had sold her to a trader heading west, despite Sarah being only 14. Eliza could still hear her sister's screams as they dragged her away. "Is my room prepared?" Judge Harlan's deep voice made her jump. He stood in the doorway, already dressed in his black coat and cravat. His gray hair was neatly combed, and his face wore its usual expression of cold authority. "Yes, master," Eliza said, keeping her eyes downcast. "Good. There's silver to be polished in the dining room. Then draw fresh water for the kitchen." He spoke without really looking at her, as if addressing a piece of furniture. Eliza curtsied and hurried past him. In the hallway, she nearly collided with Thomas, the judge's son. He caught her arm, his grip painfully tight. "Watch where you're going, girl," he sneered. At 28, Thomas had his father's height, but none of his restraint. His face was flushed from drinking, though the day had barely begun. "Sorry, Master Thomas." Eliza pulled away as quickly as she dared, feeling his eyes follow her down the hall. The morning passed in a blur of endless tasks. Eliza polished the silver until she could see her reflection in every spoon and fork. She hauled bucket after bucket from the well, her arms aching. Between chores, she caught snippets of conversation from the house. "The wedding arrangements are proceeding well," she heard the judge tell his son. "The Blackwood girl brings a good dowry. And what about my other wedding gift, father?" Thomas's voice held an ugly eagerness that made Eliza's stomach turn. She knew they were talking about her. The whole household had been buzzing with news of Thomas's upcoming marriage to a wealthy planter's daughter. But it was the other part of the arrangement that filled Eliza with dread. She was to be given to Thomas as his personal property. As evening approached, Eliza worked in the kitchen, preparing dinner under the cook's supervision. Through the door left ajar, she could hear the judge and Thomas dining in the next room. "She'll need a firmer hand than you've given her," Thomas was saying between mouthfuls, "but I'll enjoy teaching her proper respect." The judge's laugh was like dry leaves rustling. "Just don't damage her too badly. Good house slaves are hard to replace." "No promises, Father. You know how I get when I'm angry." Thomas's words slurred slightly. "Remember that field hand last month? The one who looked at me wrong?" More laughter. Eliza's hands trembled as she gripped the wooden spoon she'd been using to stir the soup. She sank into the shadows of the kitchen, her whole body rigid with rage. The spoon creaked in her grip as she listened to them discuss her future as casually as they might discuss the weather. In her mind, she saw Sarah being torn away from her. She saw the scars on the field hand's back after Thomas had finished with him. She saw her own fate stretching before her like a dark road with no end. The kitchen's shadows deepened as night crept in. The wooden spoon felt hot in Eliza's palm, as if it had absorbed all the fury burning in her chest. Through the door, the men's laughter continued, speaking of her as if she were less than human, plotting out her life like she was just another piece of property to be passed along. Eliza sat perfectly still in the darkness, feeling the rage build inside her like a fire being stoked. Each cruel word, each callous laugh, was another log on the flames. The wooden spoon creaked again in her grip, but she barely heard it over the roaring in her ears. In that moment, sitting in the shadows of the kitchen, Eliza felt something shift inside her. The familiar weight of fear and helplessness began to transform into something else, something dangerous and wild and unstoppable. She remained motionless, but inside she was burning. Morning mist clung to the ground as Eliza made her way toward the swamp's edge. The weekly task of gathering herbs for the kitchen was one of her few moments of solitude, a brief escape from the suffocating walls of the big house. Spanish moss draped the cypress trees like gray curtains, and the air smelled of wet earth and decay. She knelt in the damp soil, her basket beside her. The cook wanted mint for tea, rosemary for cooking, and whatever else might be useful. Eliza's fingers moved automatically, identifying the familiar plants she'd gathered hundreds of times before. But today, her eyes were drawn to other growths, darker things that grew in the shadows. Near a fallen log, clusters of bitter nightshade berries hung like black pearls. Eliza remembered old Mary's warnings about them, whispered late at night in the quarters. "Just 6 of those berries can stop a man's heart," the elder had said. "That's why they call it deadshot sometimes." A few feet away, she spotted the delicate white flowers of swamp hemlock, innocent-looking but deadly. Her hand hesitated over the nightshade. She'd been taught which plants could heal and which could harm. Knowledge passed down in whispers from mother to daughter, sister to sister. The elders had shared these secrets not to cause harm, but to preserve their people's wisdom. Yet now, Eliza found herself looking at these toxic plants with new eyes. The sound of a snapping twig made her jump, but it was only a water bird, stalking through the shallows. Eliza's heart pounded as she carefully picked a few nightshade berries, wrapping them in a scrap of cloth. Her fingers trembled as she added some hemlock flowers, tucking them deep in her apron pocket beneath the innocent kitchen herbs. Back at the big house, the morning's work consumed her. She scrubbed floors, beat rugs, and helped the cook prepare breakfast. All the while, the deadly plants felt like hot coals in her pocket. Every time Thomas's shadow passed a doorway, she thought of his cruel laughter from the night before. Every time she heard the judge's voice, she remembered Sarah's screams. "Eliza!" the cook called out. "Take fresh tea to the judge's study. He's meeting with the overseer." Eliza's hands shook slightly as she arranged the tea service on a silver tray. The judge took his tea the same way every day, strong and bitter, with just a touch of honey. He would hardly notice a different kind of bitterness. The thought formed in her mind like frost spreading across a window pane. She could end it. She could stop them both. The judge's cold cruelty and Thomas's hot violence. The risk was enormous. If she was caught, death would be the kindest outcome she could hope for. But the alternative, being passed along to Thomas, becoming his wedding gift, enduring whatever torments his drunk and angry mind could devise, that seemed like a slower kind of death anyway. Through the study's door, she could hear the judge discussing crop yields with Grady. The two men barely glanced at her as she set down the tea service. Not for the first time, Eliza realized how invisible she was to them. They saw her hands when they served, her labor when it benefited them, but never her humanity. Perhaps that would be their undoing. The day crawled by like a wounded thing. Eliza performed her tasks mechanically, her mind focused on what she knew she had to do. She gathered more herbs when she could, carefully selecting the most potent specimens. Each time she passed the judge's study, she observed his routine. Every evening, without fail, he took tea while reviewing his ledgers. When darkness finally fell, Eliza retreated to the small room she shared with two other house slaves. She waited until their breathing grew deep and regular with sleep. Only then did she remove the herbs from their hiding place in her apron. The stone she'd brought from the creek fit perfectly in her palm. She'd chosen another, flatter stone to use as a base. In the faint moonlight filtering through the window, Eliza began to crush the dried herbs into a fine powder. The work had to be perfect. Too coarse, and the poison might be noticed. Too fine, and it might lose its potency. Her hands trembled as she worked, but her movements were precise. She thought of Sarah, imagining her sister's face the last time she'd seen her. "I'll find you," Eliza had promised then. "Somehow, I'll find you." Now, crushing deadly herbs in the darkness, she whispered her sister's name like a prayer. The nightshade berries stained her fingers as she ground them down. The hemlock flowers crumbled easily, releasing their subtle, carrot-like scent. Eliza worked slowly, carefully, knowing that one mistake could ruin everything. The powder had to be fine enough to dissolve completely in hot tea, leaving no trace of what it contained. "Sarah," she whispered again, her voice barely a breath in the quiet room. The name gave her strength, reminded her why she had to succeed. This wasn't just about escaping Thomas or punishing the judge. It was about breaking the chains that had torn her family apart, about claiming the freedom that had been stolen from them both. The powder looked like dark dust in the moonlight. Eliza wrapped it carefully in a small square of clean cloth, then tucked it into a secret pocket she'd sewn into her dress. Around her, the other slaves slept on, unaware of what she'd set in motion. Their soft breathing mixed with the night sounds filtering in from outside. Crickets chirping, a distant owl's call, the rustle of wind in the trees. Her task complete, Eliza wiped the stones clean and returned them to their hiding place. The deadly powder felt impossibly heavy against her chest, a terrible secret waiting to be used. As she lay back on her pallet, Sarah's name still echoed in her mind, a reminder of everything she had lost and everything she stood to gain. The evening shadows stretched long across Judge Harlan's study as Eliza prepared his nightly tea. Supper had ended, and the big house had settled into its familiar quiet. Candlelight flickered against the dark wood paneling, casting dancing shadows that made her nerves jump. Her hands moved through the familiar ritual, heating the water, warming the pot, measuring the tea leaves. These motions, performed thousands of times before, helped steady her racing heart. Through the study door, she could hear the scratch of the judge's pen as he worked on his ledgers. The water came to a boil, steam rising in delicate curls. Eliza's fingers found the small cloth packet in her dress pocket, touching it like a talisman. The deadly powder she'd prepared felt impossibly light, yet it carried the weight of all her hopes and fears. She glanced around the kitchen. The cook had retired for the night, and the other house slaves were busy with their evening tasks. Only the snap and pop of the cooking fire broke the silence. Moving deliberately, Eliza opened the packet and tipped its contents into the judge's favorite cup, a fine piece of china with blue flowers around the rim. The powder dissolved instantly in the hot tea, leaving no trace. Eliza added the customary spoonful of honey, stirring until the liquid swirled smooth and dark. Her reflection in the polished silver tray showed a face calm and composed, though her heart thundered so loud she feared others might hear it. She lifted the tray with practiced ease, balancing it perfectly, as she had done every night for years. The short walk to the study felt endless. Each step had to be measured, careful. Any trembling now could betray her. "Your evening tea, master," Eliza said, her voice steady as she entered the study. The judge barely looked up from his work, waving her toward his desk with his usual impatient gesture. Thomas sat in a leather chair by the fire, a glass of brandy in his hand. Eliza set down the tray and poured the tea with precise movements. Steam rose from the cup, carrying the familiar scent of Earl Grey that almost, but not quite, masked any trace of the herbs. She stepped back, hands folded, waiting as protocol demanded. Judge Harland reached for his cup without looking away from his ledgers. He took a long sip, then paused. His brow furrowed slightly. "The tea tastes odd tonight," he muttered, glancing at the cup. "Fresh batch from Charleston, sir," Eliza said softly, her voice giving nothing away. "The merchant said it might be stronger than usual." The judge grunted and took another sip. Eliza forced herself to breathe normally, counting seconds in her head. The elders had said it wouldn't take long. Every moment felt stretched thin as spider silk. It began with a slight tremor in the judge's hand. He set down his cup, frowning. Then his face contorted, and he clutched at his throat. The pen clattered from his fingers as his whole body began to shake. "Father?" Thomas straightened in his chair, alarmed. The judge tried to speak, but only a choking sound emerged. His eyes bulged as he slumped forward onto his desk, body racked with violent spasms. "Father!" Thomas leaped up, knocking over his brandy glass. "Help! Someone help!" His shouts shattered the evening quiet. The judge's convulsions grew stronger, his face turning an ugly shade of purple. Eliza backed toward the door as chaos erupted. Thomas's continued shouting brought servants running. The overseer burst in from the hallway. Everyone was talking at once, hands reaching to help the judge who now lay twitching on the floor, foam speckling his lips. In the confusion, Eliza slipped away. Her feet carried her swiftly to the kitchen, where the cooking fire still burned low. Her hands found the tinderbox on the shelf, movements quick and sure despite her racing heart. She grabbed a pile of old rags from the cleaning basket. The kitchen door stood open to the night air. Eliza crouched by the doorframe, struck the flint, and touched the spark to the rags. The dry cloth caught quickly. She tossed the burning bundle onto a stack of empty crates near the wall, where the flames eagerly found new fuel. Shouts still echoed from the study, but now smoke began to curl through the kitchen. The fire spread faster than she'd expected, hungry flames climbing the wooden walls. Heat pressed against her face as she backed away. More shouting started. "Fire! Fire in the kitchen!" adding to the chaos. Footsteps pounded overhead as the house slaves who slept upstairs woke to the commotion. Through the windows, Eliza could see people running with buckets toward the well. The moment had come. While everyone focused on either the judge or the fire, Eliza slipped through the kitchen door into the darkness. Her feet were bare. She'd removed her shoes earlier to run better, and the packed earth felt cool against her soles. Behind her, orange light flickered in the windows of the big house. Smoke billowed up against the star-filled sky. She could hear the panic in people's voices, the crack of burning wood, and then, making her heart leap, the first bark of the dogs. The sound spurred her into motion. Eliza ran, her feet finding the path she'd planned during her herb-gathering trips. The darkness swallowed her as she fled toward the swamp, every step taking her further from bondage. More dogs joined the first, their barking growing urgent as they caught her scent. Smoke clung to her clothes and hair, and her lungs burned from both fear and exertion. But she didn't slow down. She couldn't. Freedom lay ahead in the darkness, and behind her, chaos covered her escape. The judge's poisoned body, the growing fire, the confusion of servants and slaves, all of it bought her precious time to run. The dogs' barking echoed through the night, but they sounded distant still. Eliza ran on, her bare feet barely touching the ground, each step carrying her closer to freedom. The swamp swallowed Eliza whole. Thick mud pulled at her feet with each step, sucking at her bare feet. Moonlight filtered through the cypress trees, casting strange shadows that made every stump look like a pursuer. The air hung heavy with moisture and the buzz of mosquitoes. Her legs trembled from running. Hours had passed since she'd fled the plantation, but still she pushed forward. The sounds of dogs had faded, but fear drove her deeper into the wetland. Every splash she made seemed too loud, every broken branch a beacon to those who might follow. The water rose past her ankles, then her calves. Dark shapes slithered beneath the surface. Eliza had grown up hearing tales of what lived in these waters. Snakes, alligators, things that could drag you under. But the swamp's dangers seemed small compared to what waited behind her. A branch caught her dress, tearing it. She stumbled, catching herself against a cypress trunk. Her hands shook as she tried to free the fabric. Exhaustion pressed down on her like a heavy blanket. She hadn't slept since before serving the poisoned tea, and her body screamed for rest. Looking around, Eliza spotted a raised area where several trees grew close together, their roots creating a somewhat dry space. She crawled between the twisted roots, settling into a hollow just big enough for her body. The ground felt damp but solid. Above, Spanish moss hung like curtains, offering some cover. Sleep came in fitful bursts. Every sound jolted her awake. An owl's call, a splash in the water, the creak of branches in the wind. When dawn finally came, Eliza found herself shivering, her clothes soaked through with swamp water and dew. She stayed hidden as the sun climbed higher, watching through gaps in the moss. Insects crawled over her skin, but she didn't dare move much. Voices carried far over water, and she couldn't risk being heard. Her stomach cramped with hunger. She hadn't thought to grab food in her escape. That first day passed with agonizing slowness. The sun beat down, turning the swamp into a steaming pot. Mosquitoes feasted on her exposed skin. Thirst drove her to cup handfuls of swamp water, trying not to think about what might be in it. When darkness fell again, Eliza forced herself to move. Her muscles protested, stiff from holding still so long. She oriented herself by the stars, heading north as she'd been taught. The going was slower now that hunger had weakened her. The second night brought more stumbling through the dark. Clouds covered the moon, making it harder to pick safe paths. More than once, she stepped into deep water, having to scramble back to shallower ground. Her empty stomach felt like it was eating itself. Near midnight, a distant light caught her eye. At first, she thought it was a slave catcher's lantern and froze in terror. But the light didn't move, and after long minutes watching, she realized it was a small campfire, carefully screened by raised earth and branches. Eliza debated with herself. The fire meant people, and people meant danger, but hunger and exhaustion had taken their toll. Without help, she wasn't sure how much longer she could last. Moving as quietly as she could, she crept closer to investigate. Voices drifted to her, soft murmurs, then a child's quickly hushed whimper. That sound made her pause. Slave catchers wouldn't have a child with them. Gathering her courage, Eliza stepped into the firelight's edge. An older man spotted her first, rising smoothly with a knife in hand. A woman clutched a small child to her chest, ready to run. But when they saw Eliza, dirty, exhausted, clearly a fugitive like themselves, The tension eased slightly. "Easy now," the man said softly, lowering his knife but not putting it away. "I'm Samuel. This here's Ruth and her little one." His voice was deep and gentle, though his eyes remained wary. "I'm Eliza," she whispered back. "I ran from Judge Harlan's plantation 2 nights ago." Recognition flickered in Samuel's face. "Heard talk about that place while we were moving. You're the one who poisoned the judge?" Eliza nodded, fear tightening her throat. Would they turn her away for bringing such heat on their trail? But Ruth spoke up. "Come, sit. You look ready to fall over." She shifted to make space by the tiny fire, keeping her child close. Samuel offered Eliza a piece of dried meat and a bit of hard bread. "Eat slow," he warned. "Too much at once will make you sick." The food was like sawdust in her mouth, but Eliza forced herself to take small bites. As she ate, Ruth spoke in low tones about what they'd heard. Slave catchers were combing the swamps more than usual. Judge Harlan had survived the poisoning, though he was badly hurt. The attack on such a prominent man had stirred up extra trouble. "They're offering $50 for you," Samuel added quietly. "Dead or alive?" Eliza's hands trembled. She'd hoped the poison would kill him outright, ending any pursuit. Instead, she'd only wounded him and made him more dangerous. A man like Judge Harlan, proud and cruel, would never rest while she lived free. The child stirred in Ruth's arms, blinking at Eliza with curious eyes, before tucking his face back against his mother's shoulder. The sight made Eliza's heart ache, reminding her of Sarah. Had her sister found any kindness where she'd been sold? Or was she suffering under a master as cruel as Judge Harlan? Dawn began to lighten the eastern sky. Samuel kicked dirt over their fire's remains, while Ruth gathered their few belongings. They offered to let Eliza travel with them, at least for a while. "Safety in numbers," Samuel said, though they'd have to be extra careful with slave catchers so active. They found a new hiding spot as the sun rose, a dense thicket of cane and brambles near a stream. As the others drifted into uneasy sleep, Eliza lay awake, listening to the swamp's morning sounds. The judge was alive. Her bid for freedom had failed to kill him, and now his revenge would be even more terrible if she was caught. She touched the ragged hem of her dress, remembering how she'd stood in his study, watching him drink the poisoned tea. She'd thought that one act would sever her chains forever. Instead, it had only made them heavier, even as she ran from them. After 2 days of careful movement through the swamp, Samuel led their small group toward higher ground. The water gradually became shallower, and cypress trees gave way to pine forest. Ruth carried her sleeping child while Eliza helped support Samuel, whose old injuries made long walking difficult. "The shelter's just ahead," Samuel whispered as they crested a small rise. "Preacher Williams keeps it hidden behind his barn. Good man. Helped lots of folks like us get north." Through the trees, Eliza spotted a weathered barn sitting at the edge of a clearing. It looked abandoned at first glance, with missing boards and a sagging roof. But as they drew closer, she noticed how the damage seemed purposeful, carefully placed gaps that allowed those inside to watch for approach while remaining hidden. Samuel gave a distinctive bird call, 3 short whistles followed by a longer one. After a moment, an answering call came from the barn. A young black man appeared briefly in one of the gaps, then vanished. Seconds later, a small side door creaked open. Inside, the barn smelled of hay and horses. Lantern light revealed a space divided into clever hiding spots, false walls, a root cellar entrance concealed under straw, even a loft area screened by hanging feed sacks. Several other fugitives sat or lay in these spaces, watching the newcomers with cautious eyes. The man who had signaled them stepped forward. He moved with a predator's grace, despite the obvious scars that marked his arms and neck. Around 30, Eliza guessed, with eyes that had seen too much violence. "I'm Isaac," he said simply. His gaze settled on Eliza, studying her with open suspicion. "You're new. "This is Eliza," Samuel explained. "We found her in the swamp 2 nights back. She's the one who poisoned Judge Harland." Isaac's eyebrows rose slightly. That was bold. Stupid, maybe, but bold. He gestured for Eliza to sit on a nearby hay bale. "Tell me exactly what happened. Every detail." Eliza described the poisoning, the fire she'd set as distraction, her flight into the swamp. Isaac listened intently, occasionally asking sharp questions about the plantation's layout, the number of overseers, how many dogs they kept. "You've stirred up a hornet's nest," he said when she finished. "That judge is influential. Got friends in government. They'll keep searching longer than usual." He touched one of his scars absently. "I've seen what happens when important white men get attacked. They don't let it go easy." "I had to try something," Eliza said. "They were going to give me to his son, Thomas." Isaac's face darkened. "I know about Thomas Harland. Man's got a reputation for breaking slaves, especially women." He stood, pacing the barn's length. "You did right to run. But now we need to get you far from here, fast." A quiet knock at the barn door made everyone tense. Isaac relaxed when a soft voice called out, "Just bringing food." A young white woman, clearly the preacher's daughter, slipped inside carrying a basket. She distributed bread and dried meat among the fugitives, her movements showing long practice at this work. As they ate, Isaac outlined his plan. "There's a secret landing 3 miles upstream. Friend of mine runs a flat-bottom boat, carries cargo north under cover of darkness. He can take 4 or 5 at a time." He looked at Ruth and her child. "You 2 should go first. Eliza, too. She's got the biggest price on her head." "When?" Eliza asked. "Tomorrow night, if the weather holds. Need cloud cover. Too much moonlight makes the river dangerous." Isaac's voice held the authority of experience. "I'll guide you there myself. Done this route many times." He went on to describe the journey. 2 weeks of night travel, hiding in prearranged safe houses by day. The boat would take them as far as the Ohio River. From there, they'd connect with other guides heading toward Canada. "It won't be easy," Isaac warned. "River patrol boats check cargo. Sometimes slave catchers wait at landing spots, but it's safer than trying to walk north." He looked at Eliza again. "Your poisoning showed courage. You'll need that same courage for what's ahead." The preacher's daughter returned with more supplies, clean clothes, blankets, basic medical supplies for those who needed them. She helped Ruth tend to her child's feet, blistered from walking. The woman's kindness brought tears to Eliza's eyes, reminding her that not all white folks supported the system that had enslaved her. As night deepened, the fugitives settled into their hiding spots. Eliza found a comfortable hollow in the hay near the loft. The sweet smell reminded her of happier times, helping with harvest as a child, before she'd been moved to housework, before Sarah was sold away. Isaac moved quietly through the barn, checking security, speaking softly with each person. He seemed to carry the weight of their safety on his shoulders. When he reached Eliza, he paused. "Get some rest," he said. "Tomorrow will be hard." He started to move away, then stopped. "That poison was it swamp hemlock?" Eliza nodded, surprised. "Thought so. My grandmother knew those herbs, too. Said they were a slave's last weapon." His scarred face showed grim approval. "You did what you had to do. Remember that when doubt comes." A sound floated through the night, distant but distinct. The baying of hounds. Everyone in the barn froze, listening. The dogs sounded again, closer this time. Isaac settled himself against a post near Eliza's position. His calm voice carried in the darkness. "They're closer than we thought." The first 2 nights of travel left Eliza exhausted but determined. Isaac led their small group along hidden paths, avoiding main roads and settlements. During daylight hours, they sheltered in abandoned barns and root cellars, sleeping fitfully on moldy hay, while rats scurried in the shadows. Samuel's cough had gotten worse, and their food supplies were running dangerously low. On the third evening, as purple twilight settled over the countryside, Isaac guided them toward a small cabin set back from the road. Smoke curled from its crooked chimney, and a few scraggly chickens pecked in the yard. "Farmer named Tucker lives here," Isaac whispered as they crouched in the tree line. "He's poor white folk, but he's helped runners before. Usually willing to trade food for work or small trinkets." He touched the knife at his belt. "Still, best to be careful. Samuel and I will approach first. Rest of you stay hidden until I signal." Eliza watched from behind a thick oak as Isaac and Samuel walked slowly toward the cabin, hands raised to show they carried no weapons. The door opened, spilling yellow lamplight across the packed dirt yard. A thin man in patched clothes stepped out, holding a shotgun loosely. After a brief conversation, the farmer lowered his weapon and waved the others forward. Eliza helped Ruth carry her sleeping child across the open ground, heart pounding with each step that left them exposed. Inside, the cabin was spare but clean. Mrs. Tucker, a tired-looking woman in a faded dress, stirred a pot of beans over the fire. Their children, 3 small ones, peeked shyly from behind a curtain that divided the main room. "Y'all must be hungry," Tucker said, gesturing for them to sit at the rough wooden table. His wife brought out cornbread and cups of fresh milk. "Ain't much, but you're welcome to it." The food was simple, but felt like a feast after days of dry biscuits and jerky. Eliza savored each bite of the warm bread, watching Isaac and Tucker discuss possible routes north. The farmer seemed genuinely sympathetic, describing which roads had increased patrols lately and where other fugitives had found safe passage. Mrs. Tucker put the children to bed, then offered to let them sleep in the barn. "It's warm enough with fresh hay," she said. "Safer than trying to travel tonight." Something in her tone made Eliza uneasy, but exhaustion won out over caution. They settled into the barn, grateful for the relative comfort. Samuel's coughing finally eased as he drifted off to sleep. Unable to rest, Eliza crept to the barn door for fresh air. Voices drifted from the cabin's open window. Tucker and his wife speaking in urgent whispers. "Reward money would feed the children for months," Tucker was saying. "Times are hard, Yara. We can't pass this up." "But they trusted us," his wife protested weakly. "Their property, nothing more. That girl poisoned her master. She's dangerous. We'd be doing right to turn her in." Eliza's blood ran cold. She scrambled back to wake the others, but before she could reach them, hoofbeats thundered in the distance. The slave catchers were already coming. "Wake up!" she hissed, shaking Isaac. "They've betrayed us!" Isaac was on his feet instantly, knife drawn. "Out the back, now! Samuel, help Ruth with the child." They burst through the rear barn door into darkness. Behind them, lanterns bobbed as riders approached the farm. A man's voice shouted commands. Dogs began barking. "This way!" Isaac urged them toward a cornfield. The dry stalks crackled as they ran, giving away their position. A shot cracked through the night. Ruth screamed. "Keep moving!" Isaac pushed them forward. "Don't stop for anything." The cornfield ended at a drainage ditch. They splashed across, but Samuel stumbled on the far bank. Before anyone could help him up, riders appeared at the field's edge. More shots rang out. "Go!" Samuel wheezed, waving them away. "Save yourselves!" Isaac grabbed Eliza's arm as she tried to turn back. "We can't help him now." They ran on through woods, branches whipping their faces. Ruth and her child fell behind. Isaac stopped to lift the small boy onto his shoulders, urging Ruth forward. The sounds of pursuit grew closer. Suddenly, 2 slave catchers burst from the trees ahead, cutting off their path. Isaac shoved the child into Ruth's arms and met the first man with his knife. The blade flashed in the starlight. The slave catcher fell with a gurgling cry. "This way!" Eliza called, spotting a gap between the trees. They changed direction, leaving the dying man behind. More shouts echoed through the woods as their pursuers discovered their fallen companion. Dawn was breaking when they finally stopped, having lost the sound of pursuit. They collapsed in a small hollow, chests heaving. By full light, riders combed the far tree line. Ruth pressed her boy to her chest, whispering a prayer. Then the hounds found them. Isaac dragged Eliza deeper into brush, as Ruth's cries were swallowed by the trees. By noon, the woods were quiet again. Only broken stalks and a dropped ribbon marked where mother and son had been taken. Eliza's legs trembled with exhaustion and fear. She looked at Isaac, whose clothes were dark with the slave-catcher's blood. "If not for you, I'd be gone too," she whispered. Isaac wiped his knife clean on the leaves. His voice was grim. "We're not safe yet." The words hung in the cool morning air as birds began their dawn chorus, singing as if nothing had happened in the darkness below. 5 days of constant movement had taken their toll. Eliza's feet were raw and bleeding, her stomach hollow with hunger. They traveled only at night, eating whatever they could find, wild berries, stolen corn from fields, once even a raw turnip pulled from a farmer's garden. During daylight hours, they hid in dense thickets or abandoned barns, taking turns keeping watch while the other slept fitfully. Isaac proved to be a skilled guide, reading the stars and terrain with practiced ease. He taught Eliza how to walk silently, how to listen for approaching horses, how to cover their tracks. But even his strength had limits. The loss of Samuel and Ruth weighed heavily on them both. "We're nearly there," Isaac whispered on the 5th night as they crested a small hill. "Pennsylvania. The Whitfields live just beyond those trees. They're good people, Quakers who've helped many like us." Eliza nodded, too exhausted to speak. Her dress was in tatters, caked with mud and sweat. Every step was agony on her blistered feet. But the thought of shelter, of real food, kept her moving forward. The Whitfield home was a modest 2-story farmhouse, set back from the road and surrounded by apple trees. Despite the late hour, a single candle burned in a downstairs window, a beacon for those who knew to look for it. Isaac knocked softly in a particular pattern. After a moment, the door opened just enough to reveal an elderly woman's face. Her eyes widened at their condition. "Oh, you poor souls," she whispered. "Come in. Quickly now." Inside, warmth from a banked fire filled the kitchen. The woman, Martha Whitfield, immediately set about heating water while her husband John brought bread and cheese from the cellar. "Eat slowly," Martha cautioned, placing steaming bowls of soup before them. "Your stomachs won't be used to rich food." Eliza couldn't remember when she'd last tasted something so wonderful. The soup was thick with vegetables and bits of chicken. The bread was fresh, still soft inside with a perfectly crispy crust. She found herself laughing softly at the simple pleasure of it. "Would you like to wash up?" Martha asked when they'd finished eating. "I've drawn hot water, and I have clean clothes that should fit you both." The bath was heaven. Eliza scrubbed away weeks of grime, watching the water turn dark. Martha had provided a soft cotton nightgown, and even helped Eliza comb the tangles from her hair. For the first time since her escape, Eliza felt human again. Later, they gathered in the sitting room. John Whitfield read quietly from his Bible while Martha mended clothing. The normalcy of the scene brought unexpected tears to Eliza's eyes. "Tell us of your journey," Martha said gently, setting aside her sewing. Isaac spoke of their escape, the betrayal at Tucker's farm, the loss of their companions. The Whitfields listened with grave expressions, but no judgment. "You're safe here," John assured them. "We've helped many others reach freedom. Tomorrow we can discuss your next steps, but tonight you should rest." As the evening deepened, Isaac began sharing stories of the maroon fighters he'd known, escaped slaves who lived free in the swamps, raiding plantations and helping others escape. His voice held pride as he described their courage, their refusal to be broken. "They proved we don't have to accept chains," he said. that we can fight back and win. Eliza thought of her sister Sarah, sold away that terrible spring morning. She allowed herself to imagine finding her someday, both of them free. The dream, which had seemed impossible before, now felt within reach. Martha showed them to separate bedrooms upstairs, real beds with clean sheets and soft pillows. Eliza sank into the mattress, marveling at its comfort after weeks of sleeping on hard ground. The room was small but neat, with a colorful quilt and curtains at the window. A mirror hung on one wall, the first time Eliza had clearly seen her reflection since her escape. Her face was thinner, harder somehow. The eyes that looked back at her held a new strength. She thought of all the miles behind her, the swamp, the betrayal, the desperate flights through darkness. Yet here she was, alive and free. The Canadian border was still days away, but she could almost taste the promise of true freedom. From the next room, she heard Isaac's soft snores. The sound was oddly comforting. He had become more than just a guide. He was her friend. Perhaps the first real friend she'd ever had, who wasn't bound by shared chains. Martha had left a glass of water and some bread on the bedside table. In case you wake hungry. The simple kindness made Eliza's throat tight. She wasn't used to being treated with such consideration, such basic human dignity. Through the window, she could see stars scattered across the night sky, the same stars that had guided their way north. Soon, they would light the path to Canada, where no one could legally claim ownership of another human being. Eliza ran her hands over the smooth sheets, savoring their coolness against her skin. Even the air felt different here, lighter somehow, as if the weight of bondage was already lifting from her shoulders. Freedom is close enough to touch, she whispered to herself, the words of prayer and a promise. The clock downstairs struck midnight, its chimes drifting up through the quiet house. Eliza was just drifting off to sleep when a sharp knock at the front door cut through the silence. The pounding at the door grew more insistent. Boots thundered on the porch outside. Eliza jolted awake, her heart racing as voices shouted, "Open up! We know you're harboring fugitives." Martha Whitfield burst into the bedroom, her face pale. "Quick, child!" Through the back, the front door splintered open. Heavy footsteps stormed through the house. Eliza scrambled from the bed, but her legs tangled in the sheets. She stumbled, precious seconds lost. Isaac appeared in the doorway, a knife glinting in his hand. "Run!" he hissed. Slave catchers swarmed up the stairs, their lanterns casting wild shadows. John Whitfield tried to block their path, crying out about illegal entry, but they shoved the old man aside. His head struck the wall with a sickening crack. Eliza darted for the back stairs, but two men were already coming up that way. She spun toward the kitchen, her bare feet silent on the wooden floors. Behind her, she heard Isaac fighting, the meaty thud of fists, a grunt of pain, the crash of breaking furniture. Martha grabbed Isaac's arm, surprisingly strong for her age. "This way!" She yanked him toward a window, while her husband created a barrier with his body, buying precious seconds. The last Eliza saw of Isaac was his form disappearing into the pre-dawn darkness, Martha guiding him to safety. But Eliza's own luck had run out. She reached the kitchen only to find more men bursting through the back door. Their faces were hard, eyes gleaming with the promise of reward money. She backed away, looking desperately for escape, but found only walls and cruel grins. "Well, well," drawled the lead catcher, a tall man with a scarred face. "If it ain't the poison girl herself. Judge Harlan's been mighty anxious to see you again." Rough hands seized her arms. Cold iron clamped around her wrists. They dragged her outside where a cage wagon waited, its bars stark against the lightening sky. Other captured runaways huddled inside, 3 men and 2 women, all wearing the same expression of defeated rage. The guards threw her in with no gentleness. Her shoulders struck the wooden floor hard. As they locked the cage, Eliza caught a final glimpse of the Whitfield house. Martha stood in the doorway, tears streaming down her face. John sat slumped against the porch post, blood trickling from his scalp. The wagon lurched into motion. Every jolt sent pain through Eliza's body. The other captives watched her with wary eyes. They'd heard of her, the slave who dared poison a judge. One woman edged away as if Eliza's defiance might be catching. Days blurred together in a haze of dust and misery. The guards kept water to a minimum, doling out tiny cups that barely wet their parched throats. Food was hardtack and salt pork, thrown through the bars like feeding animals. They traveled from sunrise to sunset, the Georgia heat building to unbearable levels inside the metal cage. The guards made sport of their captives' suffering. They'd hold water just out of reach, laughing as desperate hands stretched through the bars. They told graphic stories of punishments awaiting runaways, especially those who'd raised their hands against whites. Eliza's fate featured prominently in their taunts. "Here they're gonna make a real example of you," one guard sneered, poking her with his rifle barrel. "Public whipping first, then the noose. Whole town'll turn out to watch." Nights brought no relief. They slept in the wagon, chains preventing any comfort. The other captives whispered their stories. A mother trying to reach her children sold north. A man who'd fled after his wife was beaten to death. Young brothers who'd run when they learned they were to be sold apart. One woman, Nadia, had been free for 3 years before being captured. She'd built a life in Pennsylvania, even married. "My man's probably searching for me right now," she said softly. "But he'll never find me. They're taking me back to a master I barely remember." The road south seemed endless. They passed cotton fields where slaves bent double under the sun, overseers watching from horseback. Some lifted their heads to watch the wagon pass, their eyes holding a mixture of pity and fear. There, but for fortune, went they all. Each mile brought Eliza closer to what she was certain would be her death. She'd known the risks when she slipped those herbs into the judge's tea, known that capture meant execution. But knowing hadn't prepared her for this slow journey to her doom, this creeping dread that built with every turning of the wheels. On the 7th day, the wagon crossed into Georgia. The landscape grew familiar. The same red clay soil she'd walked all her life. The same towering pines that had witnessed generations in chains. As dusk approached, they crested a hill, and Eliza saw it. The spires of the town's church rising against the purple sky. Her stomach clenched. Soon she would see the judge's mansion again, its white columns stark against red brick. Soon she would face Thomas's rage, his father's cold vengeance, the temporary taste of freedom, the soft bed at the Whitfields, Isaac's stories of resistance, the dream of reaching Canada, seemed to shrivel and die. The other captives sensed her despair. Nadia reached out, her chains clinking, and squeezed Eliza's hand. No words were spoken. None were needed. They all knew what waited at journey's end. The wagon rolled on toward town as the last light faded from the sky. Eliza's heart sank deeper with each turn of the wheels, heavy as the irons that bound her. She had gambled everything on her bid for freedom. She had lost. Now came time to pay the price. Dawn painted the sky in shades of blood when the wagon rolled through the iron gates of Judge Harlan's estate. Eliza's legs trembled as the guards yanked her down, her chains rattling with each stumbling step. The familiar grounds felt foreign now. The manicured lawns, the towering oaks, the white-columned mansion that had been her prison for so many years. Other slaves peered from behind corners and through windows, their faces a mixture of pity and fear. Some quickly looked away, as if her mere presence might taint them. She recognized Adia, the cook, who crossed herself before disappearing into the kitchen. Even Grady, the overseer who delighted in dealing out punishments, watched with an unsettled expression. They marched her across the yard, past the spot where she'd gathered herbs just weeks ago. The morning air was thick with humidity, pressing down like a wet blanket. As they approached the main house, Eliza lifted her eyes to the porch. Judge Harlan sat in his favorite rocking chair, but he was changed. His once commanding posture had crumpled, his right side noticeably drooping. The arm that used to strike servants hung uselessly at his side. The doctor had called it a stroke. Eliza knew better. The herbs had finished what pride would not admit. When he opened his mouth to speak, the words came out slurred, like his tongue had forgotten its purpose. "Bring her closer." Thomas stood beside his father's chair, his face twisted with rage. His fingers twitched on the handle of his whip. "You'll pay for what you did," he spat. "Every drop of poison will cost you a pound of flesh." The guards shoved Eliza forward until she stood at the bottom of the porch steps. Up close, she could see the full extent of her work. The judge's face was slack on one side, his right eye slightly unfocused. A thin line of drool escaped the corner of his mouth, yet his left side remained alert, watching her with cold calculation. "Inside," he managed to say. "Private." Thomas started to protest, but his father silenced him with a glare from his good eye. The guards led Eliza into the mansion's dim interior. The familiar smell of beeswax and tobacco made her stomach turn. They took her up the grand staircase to the judge's private chamber, the same room where she'd served him that fateful cup of tea. The room had changed, too. The heavy curtains were drawn, leaving only thin strips of sunlight to illuminate the space. Medical supplies cluttered the bedside table, bottles of laudanum, clean bandages, a silver bell for summoning help. The proud man who'd ruled this plantation through fear could no longer even dress himself. Judge Harlan was wheeled in behind her, Thomas hovering anxiously at his side. "Leave us," the judge ordered, his good hand gripping the chair's armrest. The guards hesitated until Thomas nodded sharply. They retreated, closing the door but remaining within earshot. Silence stretched between them. Eliza stood still, chains weighing heavy on her wrists and ankles. She kept her eyes lowered, not in submission, but to hide the hatred burning in them. "Look at me," Harlan commanded. She raised her gaze slowly, meeting his. Despite his broken body, arrogance still radiated from him like heat from a furnace. "You thought you killed me." His words came out thick and halting. "Thought you were clever." "I wish I had used more herbs," Eliza said quietly, surprising herself with her steadiness. The judge's laugh came out as a wet cough. Still defiant. "Good. Makes the breaking sweeter." He wheeled closer, his good hand trembling slightly as he moved. 2 days, public punishment. Then hanging. Better the noose than being given to your son. Thomas surged forward, hand raised to strike, but his father caught his wrist with his functioning arm. "No, not yet. Wait. For the crowds." Eliza noticed how the judge's grip shook, how much effort it took him to restrain his son. The powerful man who had dominated their lives through sheer force of will was now trapped in a failing body. The thought gave her a fierce satisfaction. "You tried to destroy me," Harlan continued, dropping Thomas's wrist. "But I live, and you will die, knowing you failed." "I didn't fail completely," Eliza replied, glancing pointedly at his useless arm. "Every time you try to raise your hand to someone, you'll remember me." The judge's face purpled with rage. He tried to surge up from his chair but collapsed back, his body betraying him. Thomas steadied the chair, shooting Eliza a venomous look. "Take her away," Harlan gasped, his good hand clutching his chest. "Sell her until punishment." Thomas yanked the door open and bellowed for the guards. They rushed in, grabbing Eliza roughly by the arms. As they dragged her out, she caught a final glimpse of the judge, slumped in his chair, breathing heavily, his proud bearing broken, but his cruel spirit intact. They hauled her down flights of stairs, past the kitchen where she'd once worked, through a heavy door, and into the dank cellar. The smell of mold and rat droppings filled her nostrils. They chained her to a support beam, the iron manacles biting deep into her already raw wrists. 2 days, Thomas said from the doorway, his voice tight with anticipation. 2 days until you learn what happens to slaves who poison their masters. He turned to the guards. Prepare the whipping post in the yard. I want the whole town to witness this. The door slammed shut, leaving Eliza in darkness, broken only by thin shafts of light from the high windows. Water dripped somewhere in the blackness. Rats scurried in the corners. The chains clinked softly as she shifted, trying to find a position that didn't strain her shoulders. 2 days. 2 days until they tried to break her body as thoroughly as the judges. 2 days until they made her an example of what happened to those who dared to fight back. The cellar's chill seeped into her bones, but deep inside, an ember of defiance still burned. The summer sun blazed overhead as townsfolk gathered in Judge Harlan's front yard. They came in waves, wealthy plantation owners in fine clothes, merchants in practical suits, poor whites in worn garments, all drawn by the promise of spectacle. Handbills nailed to church doors had promised a lesson that would not be forgotten. Slave owners had brought their own slaves to watch, a forced audience meant to learn from Eliza's punishment. The whipping post stood like an accusing finger against the blue sky. Fresh cut and raw, its wood still leaked sap in the heat. Thomas had ordered it placed where everyone could see, centered between the mansion's columns, a perfect stage for his display of power. Guards dragged Eliza from the cellar, her legs weak from 2 days of darkness. The bright sunlight stabbed her eyes, making her stumble. Her dress, filthy from captivity, hung in tatters, but she held her head high, refusing to shuffle or bow. Every slave on the property watched her, their expressions carefully blank. Judge Harlan sat in his wheelchair on the porch, dabbing sweat from his drooping face with a handkerchief. His good eye followed Eliza's progress across the yard. The crowd parted before her like water around a stone, no one wanting to stand too close to a slave who had dared to poison her master. Thomas strutted before the assembled crowd, clearly relishing his moment. His fine coat was removed, shirt sleeves rolled up to show he meant to handle the whip himself. "Let this be a lesson," he called out, voice carrying across the hushed yard. "This is what happens to ungrateful property, who turn against their rightful masters." The guards forced Eliza against the post. Rough hands tore the back of her dress open, exposing skin that had never felt the lash. They bound her wrists above her head, pulling until her shoulders strained. The rough wood pressed splinters into her cheek. 20 lashes, Thomas announced, followed by hanging at sunset. He unfurled the whip, new leather, specially ordered for the occasion. The crowd pressed closer, eager for blood. "This creature tried to murder my father with poison. Today, she learns the price of such treachery." Eliza closed her eyes, pressing her forehead against the post. She thought of Sarah, of Isaac, of all those who had helped her taste freedom, however briefly. The sound of the whip cutting through air made her muscles tense. Shouts erupted from the edge of the crowd. Gunfire cracked across the yard. Eliza's eyes snapped open as chaos exploded around her. Dark figures burst from the tree line, weapons raised. She recognized Isaac's voice, bellowing war cries, leading the charge. The crowd fractured instantly. Ladies in fine dresses screamed and ran. Men reached for weapons they didn't carry. Slaves scattered in every direction, some running for safety, others seizing their chance to join the attack. The guards wheeled to face the threat, firearms raised. Isaac's maroon fighters moved like shadows through the panicking crowd. Their blades flashed in the sunlight. An overseer fell, clutching his throat. Another crashed through the garden fence, running blind with terror. Thomas's whip cracked uselessly at empty air as he backpedaled toward the house. Eliza struggled against her bonds, the ropes biting deeper into her wrists. Splinters drove into her palms as she twisted, desperate to free herself. The battle swirled around her like a storm, shouts, screams, the thunder of running feet, the sharp reports of pistols. A bullet thudded into the whipping post inches from her head. Wood chips stung her face. Somewhere behind her, she heard Judge Harlan shouting garbled commands that no one heeded. The carefully ordered world of the plantation dissolved into pure chaos. Through the mayhem, Isaac appeared before her. Blood spattered his shirt, none of it his own. His knife flashed once, twice, parting her bonds with surgical precision. As the ropes fell away, he pressed the blade into her hand. The handle was warm from his grip. "Been tracking you since Pennsylvania," he said, eyes fierce with victory. "Gathered every fighter who'd come. Time to finish this." Eliza's fingers curled around the knife. Her wrists burned, her shoulders ached, but strength flowed back into her limbs. This was the moment she had dreamed of in her cellar darkness. A chance not just for escape, but for justice. Thomas stood at the foot of the porch steps, his fine clothes dusty, his whip forgotten at his feet. He had drawn a pistol, but his hand shook as he aimed it first at Isaac, then at Eliza. His face twisted with rage and fear, the expression of a man watching his world crumble. "You'll die here," he snarled, but his voice cracked on the last word. Eliza moved forward, Isaac at her side. The knife felt right in her hand, like it had been waiting for her all along. Around them, the battle continued, but this moment crystallized into perfect clarity. She saw everything with brutal sharpness, the sweat on Thomas's face, the tremble in his trigger finger, the way his eyes darted between them like a trapped animal's. The proud man who had laughed about owning her, who had dreamed of breaking her spirit, now backed away from a slave with a knife. All his power had rested on chains and whips. Without them, he was nothing but a coward in fine clothes. They advanced together, Eliza and Isaac, step by measured step. The knife caught sunlight, throwing bright reflections across Thomas's face. He kept retreating until his back hit a porch column. The pistol wavered in his grip as they drew closer, close enough to see the pulse jumping in his throat. More shots rang out across the yard. Horses screamed. Smoke from scattered fires drifted through the air. But here, in this moment, time seemed to slow. Thomas's finger tightened on the trigger. Isaac tensed to spring, and Eliza, knife ready, felt the weight of all her pain and rage crystallize into a single sharp point of purpose. Thomas's pistol cracked, the shot going wild as Isaac slammed into him. The two men crashed against the porch column, grappling for control. The gun clattered away, spinning across the wooden boards. Before Thomas could lunge for it, Isaac drove a knee into his stomach, sending him stumbling backward. An overseer charged through the smoke, blade raised. Isaac spun to meet him, their knives clashing with the ring of steel on steel. They circled each other like wolves, leaving Eliza facing Thomas alone. Thomas snatched up his fallen whip, its leather coils rasping across the porch boards. His earlier fear had hardened into something darker, more desperate. "You should have died in that cellar," he spat, unfurling the whip with a practiced snap. Eliza gripped her knife tighter, circling to keep the porch railing at her back. Her muscles trembled with exhaustion, but rage gave her strength. She had spent too many years watching Thomas strut through the house, treating people like property. Now he faced her as an equal, and she saw the truth of him, a coward playing at power. The whip cracked near her face. Eliza jerked back, feeling the air displacement across her cheek. Thomas had trained with the whip since childhood, using slaves as practice targets. He knew how to strip flesh from bone with a single stroke. But Eliza had spent years studying his movements, learning to read his body for signs of violence. She saw his tell, the slight shift of weight before each strike, Behind her, the battle raged across the yard. Gunshots peppered the air. Smoke from multiple fires stung her eyes. The grand estate was dissolving into chaos, its carefully maintained order shattering like glass. Through gaps in the smoke, she glimpsed maroon fighters overwhelming the last guards, saw slaves seizing their chance to run. Thomas struck again, the whip singing past her shoulder. This time, Eliza was ready. She stepped inside its arc, closing the distance before he could pull back. The knife flashed in her hand, drawing a red line across his forearm. He howled, stumbling back, blood soaking his fine shirt sleeve. "Property fights back," Eliza said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. Each step forward felt like breaking another chain. From his wheelchair, Judge Harland watched with his one good eye. His useless arm lay in his lap, fingers twitching. The poison had left him a shadow of his former self, yet his presence still loomed over the scene. He tried to shout commands, but his slurred words were lost in the chaos. Thomas's next strike caught Eliza's shoulder, the whip wrapping around her arm. Pain blazed across her skin, but she grabbed the leather with her free hand, yanking him off balance. They crashed together onto the porch. The knife skittered from her grip. Thomas's hands found her throat, squeezing with desperate strength. Black spots danced at the edges of her vision. Eliza clawed at his fingers, but his grip was iron. All his privilege, all his inherited power, focused into this last attempt to maintain control. His face above her twisted with hatred and fear. Her searching hand found the knife. Without hesitation, Eliza drove the blade up under his ribs. Thomas's eyes widened in shock. His fingers loosened. She struck again, feeling resistance give way. Hot blood spilled over her hands. Thomas tried to speak, but only a wet gurgle emerged. He slumped sideways, sliding off her onto the porch boards. His blood ran between the wooden slats, dripping into the dirt below. The proud son of the house, who had expected to inherit both property and people, died staring at the sky with disbelieving eyes. Eliza struggled to her feet, chest heaving. Her throat ached where Thomas's fingers had bruised it. The knife in her hand dripped red onto her tattered dress. She turned to face Judge Harland, expecting more guards to appear, more forces rallying to protect the master. But the judge sat alone, abandoned by his servants, watching his son's blood pool at his feet. His one good eye met Eliza's gaze. In that moment, she saw something crack behind his stern facade. The realization that his power had limits, that property could rise up, that the careful order of his world could be broken by those he thought he owned. Isaac appeared beside her, breathing hard from his own fight. The overseer lay motionless in the yard below. Around them, the last sounds of battle faded. Several buildings were burning now, their smoke turning the afternoon sun blood red. Former slaves melted into the woods, seizing their chance at freedom. The maroon fighters regrouped at the tree line, calling out signals to each other. "We need to move," Isaac said, touching her arm. "More militia will come when they see the smoke." Eliza nodded, but took one last look at Judge Harland. The once powerful man who had sold her sister, who had planned to give her away like furniture, now sat powerless in his chair. His slurred voice called after her as she turned away. "You'll never be free." But his words held no power now. The chains were broken. Thomas's blood on her hands proved that even the strongest bonds could be shattered. Judge Harland and his ruined house would become just another scar, like the whip marks on her back, marking the path to freedom. Flames swept up the side of the mansion, catching the fine curtains Judge Harland had imported from Europe. The carefully tended gardens were trampled, the ordered world of the plantation descending into smoke and chaos. Years of powerful men playing at mastery ended in blood and fire. Isaac's hand found hers, warm and strong, pulling her toward the tree line. "Now we run north, for the last time." The morning mist parted like a curtain, revealing endless stretches of pine forest. Eliza stood at the crest of a hill, breathing in air that tasted different, cleaner, lighter somehow. Beside her, Isaac pointed to a valley where thin streams of smoke rose from scattered cabins. "Welcome to Canada," he said softly, "where no man can claim to own another." The words felt strange in her ears, too big to fully grasp. After weeks of travel, sleeping in barns, crossing rivers at night, always listening for pursuit, they had finally reached sanctuary. The border they'd crossed yesterday was just an invisible line on the earth, but it might as well have been a wall between two worlds. The small settlement below was called Dawn, a community of freed slaves and free-born blacks who had carved out a life in the wilderness. As Eliza and Isaac descended the hill, people emerged from their cabins to greet them. Unlike the forced smiles and lowered eyes of the plantation, these faces showed genuine welcome. Children played openly in the dirt, their laughter unconstrained by fear. An older woman named Milagros took them in, sharing her small cabin until they could build their own. She had escaped slavery 20 years ago, she told them over dinner, and now helped others make the transition to freedom. "The hardest part," Milagros said, ladling out bowls of thick stew, "isn't the running. It's learning to stand still without flinching, learning to look people in the eye, learning that you belong to yourself." Eliza nodded, understanding. Even now, her hands sometimes trembled when she reached for something without being told. Her back stiffened when white traders visited the settlement, expecting harsh words or blows that never came. But day by day, the old habits began to fade. She found work as a seamstress, her skilled fingers in demand among both settlers and neighboring farms. The money she earned was her own, to spend or save as she chose. She bought fabric, needles, thread, simple things that felt like treasures because they belonged truly to her. Isaac built them a small cabin at the edge of the settlement, facing the sunrise. He took jobs as a hunter and guide, his knowledge of tracking and survival making him valuable to the community. In the evenings, he taught other men how to fight, preparing them to defend their freedom if needed. Their cabin slowly filled with modest comforts: a proper bed, a table Isaac made himself, curtains Eliza sewed from bright cloth. Each item represented a choice freely made, a small victory over the past. The wooden walls held no shadows of masters or overseers, only the warm glow of their own hearth. Yet, even in freedom, the weight of memory remained. Eliza often woke from dreams of Sarah, her sister's face growing fainter with each passing year. She had written letters to contacts along the Underground Railroad, seeking news, but the vast machinery of slavery had swallowed Sarah without a trace. "We'll find her," Isaac would say, holding Eliza when the dreams came, "however long it takes." The settlement grew as more fugitives arrived, each with their own stories of escape and survival. Eliza listened to them all, recognizing pieces of her own journey in their tales. Some had poisoned their masters, like she had. Others had fought their way free with weapons or wit. All carried scars, visible and hidden, but here, those scars could begin to heal. Children born in freedom played alongside those who had escaped bondage. Gardens flourished in the rich soil. A small school opened, teaching both young and old to read without fear of punishment. The settlement's church rang with songs of joy instead of carefully measured hymns. Eliza learned to write, her letters growing steadier with practice. She kept a journal, recording everything she remembered about Sarah: her laugh, her way of humming while she worked, the small birthmark behind her ear. Someday, these words might help them reunite. Until then, they kept Sarah's memory alive. One autumn evening, as sunset painted the sky in shades of gold, Eliza sat at her own table in her own cabin. The day's sewing was done, the prophet tucked away in a jar she kept on a high shelf. Isaac was due back from a hunting trip soon. A pot of tea steamed before her, made from herbs she had grown in her own garden. The familiar ritual of preparing tea no longer carried echoes of that night at the plantation. She had reclaimed this simple act, transformed it from a tool of vengeance into a comfort freely chosen. The china cup in her hands was bought with her own money, selected because she liked its pattern of painted flowers. Through the open window came the sounds of the settlement preparing for night, children being called home, the distant ring of a blacksmith's hammer, someone playing a fiddle. Normal sounds, peaceful sounds, the music of people living on their own terms. Eliza lifted the cup to her lips, savoring the warmth. The tea's aroma carried memories of her grandmother's remedies, knowledge passed down through generations. But where those lessons had once been whispered in fear, now they could be spoken openly, shared with pride. The scars on her back would never fade completely. The grief of losing Sarah would always live in her heart. But here, in this place she had helped build, those wounds no longer defined her. She was more than her past, more than the property she had once been forced to be. She took another sip of tea, letting its warmth fill her. The simple pleasure of choosing when and how to drink it felt like a victory. Every free breath, every unconstrained movement, every decision made without permission, these were the true taste of freedom. Eliza looked around her cabin, at the life she and Isaac had built together. No overseer's whip waited in the shadows. No master's orders would interrupt her rest. The chains that had bound her were broken, melted down and reforged into something stronger, the power to choose her own path. Setting down her cup, she whispered words that still held their magic, still made her heart leap with joy. At last, freedom. I hope you found that story powerful. Leave a like on the video and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. I have handpicked 2 stories for you that are even more powerful. Have a great day!